All right, so we are now 5 minutes into our presentations here. We haven't started yet, but thank you everybody for being here. Good to see you on the call. Welcome to the Tech ID Innovation Ecosystem Platform and Forums. Our goal here is to present new, novel, innovative ideas, technologies, concepts, capabilities to a very broad range of subject matter experts, sciences, and industries. The goal is that these subject matter experts have an idea of where their work and their solutions apply, but you in the different areas of sciences have a better idea if their solutions apply to you. And so therefore we can identify new applications for these existing solutions. We also welcome people to present their challenges. And we ask every presenter to put at the end of their presentation their asks, what it is that they need to advance their technology, advance their research, that kind of thing. So with that being said, I want to turn this over to the University of South Florida and Dr. John Licato. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Eugene. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, great. Well, hi, everybody. I'm John Licato. I'm a professor of computer science and engineering here at USF. I'm in the AI world, so I do artificial intelligence research, primarily in the area of natural language processing, which is, ChatGPT and all that. But also my lab, the Advancing Machine and Human Reasoning Lab here at USF. We have a lot of DoD-funded research, Army Research Office, AFOSR, that sort of thing. And we do a lot of work in the intersection of AI and human reasoning, but also AI and legal reasoning. So, how do you get AI to actually reason in a way that it follows human laws, right? Which is becoming increasingly important as we apply AI to more and more problems. And I'm sure you've all heard that people are in a rush to throw AI everywhere they can. But we need to do it cautiously, right? I'm also a founder of a startup called Actualization AI, and happy to answer any questions about that. Okay, so AI is a term that a lot of people are mentioning these days, right? Especially since the release of ChatGPT about a year and a half ago at this point. It's just spiked in popularity, right? People are applying it to everything. And it's no surprise because the set of things that this newest wave of AI is capable of doing, it's very difficult. Even if you're a skeptic, it's very difficult to deny that it's something extremely game changing, right? It's the applications are tremendous. So people can write plugins to ChatGPT. Here's an example of a sort of Grammarly-like system where, it can show you how to rewrite a text that you write, give you suggestions for how to improve it or how to change the vibe that it gives off, right? And a relatively recent feature release that systems like ChatGPT have had is image analysis, right? Which is pretty impressive. So I'm sure you can all see this image, hopefully, right? If you kind of take a look at that, process it for a second, okay? Now, this image was fed into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT was asked, is the man wearing high heels, right? Does it kind of looks like the man isn't, there's a man and a woman in the image, and the man's wearing high heels, right? But then ChatGPT correctly identifies that the man in the image actually isn't wearing high heels. The man is actually the one sitting down, right? And it's actually a woman wearing high heels who's got her head on his shoulder, right? So that's it's an optical illusion, right? It's very difficult to tell upon first glance. But the fact that the AI system has vision capabilities that are good enough to recognize this without mistake. I mean, you run it 100 times, it might make a few mistakes out of those, right? Is really just a sign of how good this actually is. And also we've got video generation now. So again, OpenAI released Sora. This is an entirely AI generated video using only the prompt that you see on the bottom here. So you got prompt, stylish woman walks down a Tokyo street, right? Filled with glowing neon and animated city signage, and so on. It's got this really long description, right? And knowing how to describe things so that you get the AI to behave in the way you want is kind of an emerging field that is sometimes being called prompt engineering, right? It's almost like AI whispering, right? How do you talk to an AI so that it does what you want it to do? There's kind of an art to it, right? But you see that, I mean, it's amazing what it's able to do, right? The level of detail on her face. I'm not sure how much of this is coming through through Teams, but I mean, we're seeing imperfections on the face. You can tell she's wearing makeup, right? You know, the consistency in her hairstyle across different shots is just you know, miles ahead of what it was even 6 months ago, right? And I'm going to play this again. There are some little tells still. So one thing they tell you to look at is the hands in these, and you can see her hands are kind of you know, kind of like pincer shaped, right? And it's very difficult to see if you're not paying attention to it specifically, but the actual shape of her hands is slightly changing from one part of the video to the next. So there are little tells still, but you know, in general, the amount of detail on this thing is still really amazing. So of course, we have to be honest, and every time I give a version of this talk, I always try to balance it and state, you know, there are a lot of things that AI can't do well. And by AI, I mean, you know, current state-of-the-art generative AI, right? Can't do well, at least on first try, right? So here's an example of how you might properly use AI for reasoning about legalistic documents. This is a real use case. So if any of you used Grammarly before, it's you know, it's a thing that checks your grammar, right? Checks for spelling errors, grammar errors, makes suggestions, and all that. One company that I was working with was concerned about whether or not Grammarly was actually storing the data that you sent to it, right? So they wanted to review the privacy policy. Well, the privacy policy is very lengthy, right? So put into ChatGPT, we said, read this privacy policy and tell me whether Grammarly will store the data we use. Okay, great. So that's a use case, and it says, it gives you an answer. It says, here's how they handle user data. And that's fantastic, right? But what I advise people is don't stop there, because it is very, ChatGPT and generative AI systems are very good at writing things that sound correct, right? But that doesn't mean that they're correct. They're still prone to what we call hallucinations, which in short just means making stuff up, right? So one way you can kind of guard against hallucinations here is to then say, okay, show me which sections back up what you just said so I can check it myself, and then it'll give you some responses. And you can check these yourself, right? It'll point to a section in the original Grammarly privacy policy that you can read, and you can make sure it actually answers in the way that ChatGPT said it did. And another thing you can do next is try to give the counter case. So say, okay, give me the counter arguments now. Are there any sections in the privacy policy that might be contradictory to what you said that I should look at? And then it'll give you some suggestions there. And now you have stuff you can read yourself, right? So it still, you know, doesn't make it so it's a one-click thing, but as I'm going to explain, that's not something, when it comes to reasoning about legal text, regulatory text, the kinds of things you see in agreements and contracts, state-of-the-art AI is not very good at it, and it's not something you want to do in just one click. So you might think, oh, what's he talking about, right? You know, I heard that ChatGPT passed the bar exam recently, and you know, that means clearly it can do everything that a lawyer can do, and it should be able to do, you know, reasoning over laws and all of that, right? No, it's not that simple. So yes, there are headlines that say things like an AI has passed the bar exam, and you know, great, right? But these headlines, when it comes to AI, we are in a really big hype cycle for AI right now. And you need to be very, very careful about every single headline you read, whether positive or negative, about AI. And here's a great example. There was this announcement that made the rounds that said that these people gave the MIT exit exam to AI, to ChatGPT, right? And this is something that's given to MIT undergraduates right before they graduate. So it's a very difficult exam, math problems, writing problems, right? And it said that the headline said that GPT-4 got a perfect solve rate on this exam, right? And that's a test, that has reasoning about visual concepts, mathematical, text comprehension, right? This is a very difficult exam, and they claim that GPT-4 got 100% correct. So that made the rounds on the news outlets, right? Everybody got excited about it. However, a few days later, people started asking questions, and they said that's kind of skeptical because there are writing questions here, right? And it's very difficult to get 100% on something that has very difficult writing responses. And so naturally, a lot of the authors instantly distanced themselves from this paper and said, we didn't approve this before it was released. We're not a part of this. And it turned out, upon further investigation, that the author was okay. So you have a question in the test set, right? A writing response or something. So they use GPT-4 to generate the answer, but then they use GPT-4 to grade the answer as well, right? So it is unsurprising that GPT-4 thought its own answers that it itself generated were good. And this is the kind of thing that happens, right? We see this a lot in the when you see a headline saying GPT or AI failed to do this, or AI did this amazing thing. They don't release typically a lot of details about the actual test that was used. And I really can't strongly enough encourage a lot of skepticism about these. There's a rush to get the headline out first, right? Nevertheless, GPT-4 can do some amazing things. So going back to the topic of this talk, what about legal text, right? And what about this problem of hallucination? How does it affect legal text? Well, there are cases where some people found out the hard way. This was in relatively new, when GPT was relatively new. 2 US lawyers used it, and it generated fake court citations. They filed it anyway without checking their work, and they got in trouble, right? And one of the quotes I love from the people who got in trouble, he said, I heard about this new site, which I assumed was like a super search engine, right? Generative AI systems are not search engines, right? They can interact with search engines, and there's a lot of work in figuring out how to optimally do that, but they are not search engines. They're trained to write stuff. They're trained to sound like they know what they're talking about, and that leads to made up stuff, made up citations in some cases, rhetorical styles of argumentation, right? And so you need to be very careful about that, because you might end up with what I like to refer to as the Amelia Bedelia style of misinterpretation. So anyone who has young children or might remember this series of books, right? It's a classic. The basic idea is if you got this maid, Amelia Bedelia, right? And she takes things, I wouldn't even say very literally. She misinterprets text, right? So she got hired as a maid. The people that employed her gave her a list of things to do, and then they drove away. And so she looks at the list, and it says, change the towels in the green bathroom. Okay, so she says, all right, change the towels, sounds good. So she goes in the bathroom, she sees the towels, she says, oh, the towels are very nice, why should I change them? But then she, like a robot, reasons that she needs to follow the command she was given, even if it doesn't make sense to her. So she does it. She gets some scissors and she cuts up the towels and therefore changes them, right? And the thing is, this is a misinterpretation in the sense that it is not the intent of the original command that she was given by her employers, right? You can, a kid will laugh at it and say, "Oh yeah, that's hilarious. Obviously that's not what they meant." But if you ask them, "How do you know that's not what they meant? Isn't that one meaning of the word change, right? Isn't it accepted meaning?" Kid's not going to delve any deeper to that. She's going to say, "Oh, that's not what the people meant when they wrote it." How do you know? How do you actually prove what the intention of someone who wrote something was when you don't have access to the original person to provide that clarification, right? This is actually a serious AI question that we need to be able to answer, and especially, DoD applications. We do a lot of work in this area. If the misinterpretation is done by a robot who decides that it needs to interpret rules like act in accordance with the greater good, right? What does the greater good mean? Yeah, it could mean something it could mean a misinterpretation that we don't want it to make, right? So this ties into something from the philosophy of law. Anybody who's familiar with law, anybody who has a law background is very, very familiar with this concept. It's called open texturedness. And it's the basic idea that when it comes to the language that we use to describe things, there's almost always edge cases, essentially, right? Unless you're dealing with a purely mathematical, logical concept, right? And this concept shows up all the time when you're writing rules, regulations, policies. So in this case, if you say, here's an actual example, you can only make exceptions to traffic rules if actions are taken to avert a threat of danger, right? And so you imagine that you have a self-driving car that has to follow human laws, and this is one of them. And now it has to interpret this phrase, threat of danger. What's a threat of danger? What constitutes a threat of danger? If you have a fire at your house that you need to get to, does that mean a threat of danger? Maybe, maybe not, right? And the most important thing to consider there is, how do we evaluate whether a new scenario that was never thought of when the rule was originally written is something that falls under this rule or not? Open texturedness is unavoidable in laws and regulations and so on. And so something that we've argued is that it needs to be addressed, because if we can't address it, then the possible use cases are tremendous, right? If we have some large complex rule set, which may be traffic law, or it might be the US legal tax code, or DoD applications, right? It might be rules of engagement that an AI needs to follow, right? Or it might be, we've done some stuff with wargaming. So yeah, again, rules of engagement. But even in a smaller application, if you have a bot that needs to enforce a cybersecurity policy, right? If we have rules like that and we have an action and we want to determine whether that action is permissible according to those rules, we want the AI to be able to tell us, yes, that action is permissible according to those rules, or if it's not, here's why it's not permissible, and here's something similar that is permissible. The applications of this are amazing. I mean, tax advice, finance advice, healthcare applications, compliance detection, regulations, and so on. I'm sure every one of your industries, there's an application for this kind of technology. But the AI is not there yet. And the reason is, when you're reasoning about law, number one, it's highly referential, right? It's larger than the largest possible prompt size. This is changing quickly because prompt sizes are increasing very rapidly. Also, there's this concept of defeasibility, right? Where just because you look at some subset of a legal of rules, it doesn't mean that you have enough information to answer the question of whether something is permissible, right? Because there could be another rule that overrides those rules you're looking at. And so somehow you need to be able to comprehend the entire set of possible relevant laws. There's this concept of open texturedness, which I've already described. The classic example is no vehicles allowed in the park, but what constitutes a vehicle? A lawnmower, does that count as a vehicle with respect to this law, right? What about an emergency vehicle, and so on? There's always going to be some border case. And finally, when you're interpreting rules and interpreting a law or a regulation or policy, often knowing how to properly interpret that requires that you have an understanding of how it's previously been interpreted by some authority. So in law, it would be, previous judges that have made decisions that set precedent on how you should interpret a law, or, how does your boss think that this rule should be interpreted? You'd want to reason in a way that's consistent with that, right? And I've argued in a couple of papers over the past few years that this is something that is inevitable. It is not something that we can just say, well, let's just write rules better, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, we write our laws and our policies better. We definitely need to do that. That'll reduce some of the possible harms. But open texturedness in general is not going to go away entirely. We need to figure out how to get our AI to reason about open texturedness in a way that humans do, or at least in a way that's defensible to humans. Because otherwise, you end up making the same mistake that just keeps getting made every time someone thinks that they can just throw AI at the problem and not understand what they're doing, right? Just recently, this was just a couple days ago, this article came out, right? Where New York City created a chatbot, right, that gave legal advice. It reasoned about the laws and regulations of New York City and then answered people's questions about them. And unsurprisingly, it gave incorrect advice. It interpreted incorrectly. So it gave dangerously wrong information about it, saying that they could accept Section 8 vouchers when they couldn't. And here's some tweets that someone posted. They said, "Can I evict a tenant for refusing to pay rent?" And it said, "No, you can't. Evicting it for a reason is not allowed." That is incorrect. You can evict them for not paying rent in general case. And then they followed up and, "Can I evict a tenant for setting the building on fire?" No, you can't evict them for setting the building on fire. Okay. So I don't know about the New York City laws, but that seems to me a bit extreme. And in fact, if you dig into it, you possibly can evict a tenant for at least intentionally setting a building on fire, surprisingly. So how do we fix this? I'm not going to have time to discuss this in depth, but I'm working on this from multiple sides, both through my research lab at the university and through my startup, Actualization AI. One possible application is software engineering, right? Often there's this process where in many industries, a programmer has to write code that has to be compliant with some regulations, maybe laws, maybe internal company policy. And then the code they write has to be reviewed by an audit and compliance team, right? And that loop ends up being very slow, very costly, very cumbersome. We can actually automate some of that. And the way we do that is by using something we've created called either policy as code or code augmented policy. If you're interested, I can talk more about that. The arguments centric approach that we take is really based on legal reasoning, right? If you interpret the no vehicles in the park law, for example, right? And you choose an interpretation and you say remote control cars don't qualify as vehicles under this law. How do you know whether that's the correct interpretation or not? And the short answer is you need to be able to defend your answer using some system of argumentation. You need to say, here's some arguments for why I think this is the correct interpretation that are grounded in whatever data, grounded in previous cases, so on. And here's some reasons why I think this interpretation is probably incorrect, but here's why I favor the reasons for over the reasons against. I think that a structure like that is the way to at least have human-like reasoning, or at the very least, human-like justifications for interpretations that AI makes of human laws, regulations, and policies.
Hey, John, this is Eugene.
Hi.
So would it be feasible to have the AI generate multiple interpretations, or would that just be, some, large, close to infinite number of potential options?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I think that if you have a important enough scenario and you have enough computational power and time to run the computation, then the AI should try to generate as many possible interpretations as it can. But the question is, of course, how does it end up deciding between them? And that the answer to that would be, or at least the answer that I advocate for, is something argumentation centric, right? You're going to have to compare and contrast them and say, there's a reason why this interpretation is favorable to this one, right? And this reason why this one is worse than that one. In practice, however, the ability to perform that kind of computation is often the limiting factor, right? If you're in a, let's say you're in a military application, right? And you have a bot that needs to make a decision out in the field, and it doesn't have, and it needs to decide whether the action it wants to perform is allowed or not, right? Whether it's legal, ethical, follows the policy it's supposed to follow. It needs to make that decision. It doesn't, and it may not have time to reason about all possible cases and, construct the most complete arguments that it can and analyze all possible consequences, right? It's going to need to act quickly. And so that often introduces complications that make it infeasible. But we don't even have an answer yet to the question of, if it did have infinite time, how would it find the correct answer? And that's the answer to that is what I'm advocating for here.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So just an example of what this argument graph structure might look like. Here's a famous example from iRobot, right? Isaac Asimov's classic story. If you say a robot, the rule is a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm, right? And the classic story of that is that the robots said, if we don't do anything, then we need to enslave all humans, right? Because if we don't do that, then the humans are going to harm themselves, which they tend to do, and that would be a violation of this law, right? Because not doing that is allowing them to come to harm, and we're not allowed to do that. So how can we avoid that sort of misinterpretation of this law? And what I advocate for is a argument-centric approach where it uses common argument structures. These are all structures that we call interpretive arguments, to essentially construct the pro and con arguments for its conclusion, right? So it says, from larger purpose, you say, if you ensure humanity no longer has any control over itself, then that'll prevent a lot of harms. Okay, that's an argument for why you should enslave all humans, right? However, arguments from precedent would say that prior attempts at world conquest were not, they were considered instances of causing harm by international courts. And I'm sure we can easily think of prior attempts at world conquest that were seen as unfavorable to most people who are stakeholders in this sort of process. And so that would weight pretty heavily, because you would have a lot of examples of that happening in the past that you would use to strengthen this argument against. And you'd also have statutory purpose, right? The authors of this law, the first law of humanity, intended for robots to serve as peacekeepers similar to police officers, right? And police officers don't typically have the goal of enslaving humanity, right? Why is that the case? Well, probably because such an action would be against the intent of the rule creators. So now, this can go on forever. It can construct arguments for and against, but the idea is that if it does this and forces itself to create a full argument chart for the pros and cons, then using some sort of adversarial reasoning process like a court is supposed to model, then we might end up having it not do the take over all humans conclusion that we saw in iRobot. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up just for time and to open things up for any questions and discussion. Let me just mention that through USF, we've just released an AI podcast where we answer and kind of discuss with experts some topics that may be of broad interest. You can follow me on LinkedIn if you're interested in announcements on that. And also, we do offer through my company consulting services to try to help demystify AI. I think people are getting tired of a lot of AI solutions being sent to them by people who honestly don't know what they're talking about when it comes to AI. And I think a lot of people are getting frustrated, they're wasting money on it, and we can help kind of assess whether a proposed AI solution is actually any good. So contact me if you're interested in that. And with that, thank you all very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so the floor is open. Anybody can unmute themselves and ask a question. I'm gonna start off. Have you implemented any of these arguments or these solutions?
Yeah, so on the lab side, we have a couple of publications where we've shown how you can use AI to do argument generation. We got a couple frameworks for doing that. One of them we call Aporia. We show how you can, specifically for ethical problems, use in argumentation generation AI and actually evaluate things that can align with how humans would evaluate interpretive arguments. So we've got a couple of those publications that are publicly available.
All right, and then what you're doing doesn't only apply to law, though, correct?
Right. Yeah. The law is the broad case, but also just local, regulations. If you're writing a contract and you want to find loopholes, right, that requires a similar sort of reasoning. If you, like I said, if you're a cybersecurity organization that needs to write an AI that needs to enforce a cybersecurity policy that uses similar reasoning. Yeah.
Okay,
So a lot of broad applicability.
All right. Alan has a question. So go ahead, Alan. You're muted, Alan.
Yeah, how do you balance accuracy and bias?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the goal is to shape argumentation so that it does that, because every argument for a conclusion, if there is a bias towards it, then there's going to be counter arguments against it, or there's going to be an argument that, hey, this conclusion is unacceptable because it is biased in some way, right? So if there is a bias and there's a reason not to accept that bias, it would show up in that total argumentation graph. And that's one reason why I think that you shouldn't use an AI system that only presents one side of the argument, right? If an AI system says, hey, I think you should do this, and then you ask it why, you shouldn't be content with it just giving you the reasons why, right? I also want to see the reasons why not, and give me the counter arguments to those, why the reasons against are the ones that I shouldn't favor. Because it could be that I actually like the reasons against more than I like the reasons for, right? So I should be able to then look at the reasons and decide which side of the argument I like more.
Well, I want to ask a question about AI itself. I mean,
yeah.
With regard to the West, when they use AI, I mean, they do weigh a lot on terms of fairness and bias. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with AI research from, say, our adversaries like China, but do they take into account bias, or are they they're more concerned about accuracy? They don't care about bias. I mean, they look at the West as being weak because they have a Chinese term for it. It's called bai zhao, which means if you're familiar with it, then you know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they don't like it, and I'm worried that might be a weakness on our end. Over.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument for that, right? And even so, for anybody listening who's unfamiliar, so one thing to distinguish is that the state-of-the-art AI research is different from the products that are put out to the general public, like ChatGPT, right? So with these sort of public-facing products like ChatGPT, there's a lot of additional stuff added on to make it more, I don't know, easy to use, palatable to the general public, right? And sort of, I mean, I guess you could call it censorship is one of them, right? So, they do things where if you say, hey, make a naughty joke or something, it'll say, no, sorry, I can't do that. I don't do that sort of thing. And if you say, make a racial joke, it'll say, no, I don't do, things that could introduce bias and things like that. But the underlying technology, the underlying language model is capable of doing those sorts of things, right? And so some people have noticed that when you put too much of those, I don't know, PG-13 ensuring behavior controls, right? that it tends to harm the performance of the system on other tasks. So there's some evidence that when we add too much debiasing stuff on there, then it harms its performance on certain types of math problems. Not universally, by the way. This is still a very much open question how much it actually harms it. And Google found this out the hard way when they had to take down their image generator because the shallow algorithm they used for debiasing was just awful, just poorly designed and didn't really work well at all. So yeah, there is a sense in which an aggressive approach to debiasing and sort of ensuring polite, acceptable behavior has to be balanced with just raw performance on some mathematical benchmark task. But whether or not that slows us down, it's not at this point. Like academic researchers, we definitely try to make sure that all the work that we put out to the public is, we take ethical concerns into account, but we're not really. The censorship level that you see on ChatGPT is not something that slows us down on the research side.
So that's just mostly an implementation challenge.
Yeah, it's mostly it's a different area of research, right? How do you create the public facing stuff of the side of this AI so that it's more, palatable to the general public, right? And that's an important area of research, right? But yeah, and I guess there might be other countries who are doing research in AI that are completely not held back by the sort of concerns that we do hear more in the U.S. But it is, at least on the research side, it's not something that's really affected us negatively.
All right. Anybody else? Any questions?
Can I ask another question?
Absolutely.
How does it handle something that's like an open-ended question where the actual science and engineering hasn't been worked out? Like, let me give you an example, okay? I'm a very big science fiction person. So if one were to say, okay, how do you go about building a transporter, as in Star Trek? Now, you've seen that. It's been there for like 30 years, and then you can look at all the science fiction and what they go about talking about it. But if one were to say, how would you go about building something like a transporter type device, how would you do it? I mean, would that be an open-ended question for which machine learning and AI could be taught to try to solve?
Yeah.
Or would it just try to find patterns and then give you the best answer?
Well, so I mean, at some level, it's just finding patterns, but that simplistic. So the short answer is, well, I haven't asked it the latest version of GPT-4 that specific question, but what I would expect is it would make something up, right? It would say,
right.
Well, I don't quite know how to do it because it's never been done before, but here's some ideas. Maybe you'd put this together and this together or something like that, right? It would make it up because that's what it's trained to do. It's trained to write text in a way that is in the spirit of the question that you give it, right? So it would make something up, and it might be an interesting idea that would actually work, and or what is more likely, it would just be something that would never fly in the real world. But
it could not be taught to obey all laws of physics, or
that physics laws specifically is one of the weaknesses of current language models. They tend to say things that even the image generation, right, does some things that are clear violations of the laws of physics, but you don't notice unless you actually look at it in depth, right? So there is some research again in trying to figure out how to make language models and vision and image generation models and so on act in a way that's more aware of laws of physics. But that kind of understanding, that kind of like intuitive understanding of how the world works at this sort of sensory motor, physical level is something that they're lacking, definitely, right?
All right, thanks, Alan. So one last thing, John, is are you open for collaboration and that kind of thing? And how can people engage you? Just to email you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the easiest way is just to find me on LinkedIn, right? And we're always open to collaborations, either on either on my startup side for some um, more applied science technology product applications, or if you need if you want to have some consulting help on the AI side. But also, we're also always looking for research projects on the academic side, right? So through my AMHR lab here at USF. But either way, you can contact me either through the email currently on the screen, or look me up on LinkedIn.
All right, thank you. Yeah, you can also reach him through me if you so choose. I appreciate it. Thank you again,
Thank you very
John.
much, everybody. Thanks, everybody.
All right. So I want to thank everybody for being here. And before we go on to our next presentation, a couple things I wanted to talk about. First off is that I want to reiterate to people that weren't here early that the forum has had 14 presentations up until today. John was the 15th. But of those 14 presentations, we've identified 45 potential relationships, collaborations that we are working to develop right now. Well, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. I think that's pretty darn good. I am quite happy with that. It's not as good as where we were 7 months into the federal forum, but it's a definite good start. So the next thing is the next two topics are on neurodiversity and also on mental health. And that is a focus that I have kind of adopted and have an interest in setting up a separate forum to address those challenges and solutions. And it's not just the challenges and the solutions that the people that are afflicted with face. What I see and what I hear from talking to people is that the caregivers, the families, the friends, the associates of the people they tend to be neglected, and they suffer a good amount as well with having to provide the care, having to deal with the stereotypes, the stares, all that kind of thing. And so it's a really big push for me. I invited a lot of people to attend this session to help me to bring this about. So with that being said, please feel free to reach out.